Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naman Haptom. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Cambridge, as well as a research assistant at the Center for Geopolitics as part of their Baltic program. Thank you all for joining us for what I'm sure will be a fascinating event. The Baltic Sea region is arguably one of the world's most prosperous and most peaceful regions. No conflict has been fought there since 1945. Yet, following the end of the Cold War, countries in the region have increasingly begun deploying their forces in military operations, which have spanned across the world, ranging from Afghanistan to Iraq to Kosovo to Mali and beyond. The nature of these engagements vary considerably, whether it's full-scale wars, peacekeeping operations, or anti-piracy missions, along with others. Our hope today is to take a closer look at three particular countries, Denmark, Estonia, and Sweden, in order to understand what is actually driving these countries to pursue these policies over the past 30 years. On Denmark, we have Rasmus Mariager, who's a professor of modern Danish political history at the University of Copenhagen. In 2019, the Danish parliament appointed him as head of research for an independent inquiry that examined the Danish political decision processes prior to Denmark's military engagement in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The inquiry was published in 4 volumes in 2019. After him, we have Roxana Sjöstedt, who is speaking on Sweden. She's an associate professor of political science and director of peace and conflict studies at Lund University. Her research is centered around military and non-military threats, international military intervention, securitization, and norm diffusion and socialization. She has published on these topics widely in journals such as Security Studies, European Journal of International Security, Security Dialogue, and others. Finally, we have Martin Hurt, who will be talking about Estonia. He's a former Estonian Ministry of Defense official and a research fellow at the moment at the International Center for Defense and Security. His areas of research include developments in Nato and the EU, as well as national security and defense-related topics in the Nordic-Baltic region. At the Estonian Ministry of Defense, Hurt worked on various positions, including as Undersecretary for Defense Investments and Deputy Director of the Defense Policy and Planning Department. Now, without any further ado, let me hand it over to Rasmus to kick our event off. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first, thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel. It's really a great pleasure to be here. In the next few minutes, I will talk about why Denmark decided to engage militarily in the conflicts in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. As mentioned, my background for talking about this topic is that in 2016, I was appointed head of research by the Danish Parliament, who commissioned a group of historians and political scientists to conduct an independent inquiry of the reasons why Denmark chose to engage militarily in these 3 conflicts. We started our research in early 2017, and 2 years later, in 2019, we published our inquiry in 4 volumes. We were to answer 3 questions. First, why did Denmark go to war? Second, how was the political decision process? And third, how was the dialogue between the governments and the Danish Parliament? To answer these questions, we were given full and free access to all relevant documents in the Danish central administration. As such, we had full and unimpeded access to highly classified documents from the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, both the Danish intelligence services and the armed forces. Also, we had the opportunity to conduct interviews, both with politicians and civil servants, for instance, diplomats, if we wanted to, and we did. And our analysis led to 3 general conclusions. First, we concluded that Denmark's military engagement in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq reflected the willingness of Danish policymakers to meet the United States' requests for military contributions. In general, there was no direct pressure from the United States with threats or sanctions or promises of gain if Denmark did not meet the American requests. On the contrary, Danish decision makers simply decided to meet American preferences on their own initiative. Second, we concluded that the Danish decisions to participate in the wars were shaped rather than decided upon at a single meeting. As such, the decisions were the results of rather long processes in which both the decisions to contribute and the content of the military contributions were shaped by key ministers, officials, and representatives of the armed forces in close dialogues with alliance partners, most importantly, the United States. Rather than a crucial meeting where the key decisions were taken after balancing possible costs and gains, it was a series of smaller decisions that gradually narrowed down the scope for action and at the same time increased the cost of pursuing alternative options. Third, we concluded that the government's dialogue with the parliament took place largely through informal channels, such as personal contact between key ministers and party leaders rather than official meetings. Also, we concluded that Danish government generally had a minimalist information practice vis-à-vis the parliament. Shifting governments no doubt respected the law and informed the parliament about the projected agreements. However, it was only late in the process that the governments consulted the Foreign Policy Committee, which is part of the Danish parliament. So these were our three general conclusions. Next, the parliament asked us to provide the parliament with a so-called learning aspect. That is, which lessons could be learned from our inquiry. In this part of our research, we should identify challenges in the decision-making process, which politicians and civil servants should and could address in the future. One of the first things we observed was the circumstance that Denmark has had a very ambitious military engagement after the end of the Cold War, and certainly a much more ambitious military engagement than during the entire Cold War period. During the 45-year-long Cold War period, Denmark was engaged in 13 military conflicts in Europe and elsewhere, especially in Palestine and on Cyprus. All of these military engagements were undertaken in close cooperation with the United Nations, and the military engagements were always based on a clear UN mandate. After the end of the Cold War, Denmark has decided to station soldiers abroad almost 80 times. 80 times. This is sixfold the number of Danish military engagement during the entire Cold War period. And that is the situation even if the Cold War era counts only some 30 years. The post-Cold War era counts only some 30 years. And if we look at the institutional anchoring, the picture is also rather different than earlier. Sometimes Denmark's military engagement after the Cold War has been anchored in the UN on the basis of UN mandates. Other times, Danish troops have been sent to war in ad hoc coalitions without UN mandates. Even other times in the context of Nato, sometimes with a UN mandate and other times without a UN mandate. Furthermore, our inquiry showed that Danish military operations after 1990 have almost always been tied to the United States in one way or another. The inquiry thus showed that Danish decisions to send troops abroad after 1990 lack a fundamental discussion of the principles behind Denmark's military engagement. That is, apart from the fact that the Danish military engagement is tied to the United States. Against this background, we recommended that the government should formulate a number of principles for how to prioritize Denmark's military involvement abroad. This should make it possible to prioritize in the international demand for military contributions in the future. Also, it would make it possible for Denmark to conduct a more independent and less demand-driven policy in this field. Secondly, the inquiry documented that the Danish decision-making processes were characterized by the absence of a systematic discussion of, for instance, objectives when we send troops abroad, means, expected impact, questions of resources, risks, timeframes, exit options, alternatives, and consequences of saying no to participate. Against this background, we recommended to establish a procedure to ensure that these and other relevant questions are clarified before the decisions to send troops abroad are taken. And thirdly, our analysis showed that both governments and the Danish parliament lack advice that systematically incorporates experiences from previous military engagements when they are about to decide new military activities. There were no lessons learned that we used in the decision-making process prior to the decision to send Danish troops to Kosovo. Neither did previous war experiences play any role whatsoever in the central administration when Denmark decided to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. On this basis, we recommended to establish a transverse analysis unit in the central administration. The purpose of this unit should be to provide the government and the parliament with useful and relevant information from the past. So these were our 3 recommendations. And then I just have one brief comment and I'll finish, okay? If we look at Danish decision makers' arguments for supporting the United States in the wars in the 1990s and after the turn of the century, the arguments were about Denmark's short-term and long-term interests. No argument was too big and no argument was too small. The big arguments were about Denmark's strategic interest in a close relationship with the United States in the area of security policy in a world of rogue states and terrorism. It was about Danish politicians talked about Denmark's foreign policy tradition for peacekeeping, Denmark's tradition for humanitarian intervention, traditional Nordic priorities in international politics, and the need to strengthen the international community. The smaller arguments included Denmark's role and influence at upcoming NATO summits. So the big question must be, how did it happen that Denmark became a warmonger after 1990? I would argue that the combination of American power surpluses and the absence of threats to the Danish territory certainly provided part of the answer. The offensive Russian foreign policy of recent years, combined with the United States that is less willing and able than in the past to defend the order that was built up after the Second World War and expanded in the early years after the end of the Cold War, shows us that this situation is changing. Therefore, I'm quite sure that Denmark will have to adjust its military engagement in the near future, actually in the quite near future. So these were my words. I'll stop here and thank you once again for inviting me.
Thank you, Rasmus, and hand it over to Roxana.
Thank you, Naman, and thank you also for inviting me here. I have a couple of slides that I want to use to illustrate my main points. I think David was going to help me to share them with the audience. Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, the focus of Sweden's national security over time has shifted from being a traditional territorial defense to a focus on so-called out-of-area operations missions. Lately, there's been a sort of pendulum going back. The shift is on both, you can say. And I will get back to that in the final slide. But just to begin by commenting on this picture, I believe it illustrates a key aspect of Swedish foreign policy more broadly, and also of its military engagement as an extension of this foreign policy. And this particular picture was part of a campaign by the Swedish Armed Forces in August last year, right before the Pride Festival in Stockholm. And this is sort of a play or like a take on the famous picture from World War II, which I believe many of you have seen, when American Marines put up the American flag on the island of Iwo Jima. But this picture was actually, this Swedish picture was an advertisement, and this advertisement covered a whole page in the conservative broadsheet Svenska Dagbladet, and it had the capture, "A flag worth defending." And of course, there were some controversy over this picture. Some people were against it, some people believed it was good. But I will argue that this picture clearly illustrates one key motivation of the Swedish international military engagement, namely humanitarianism. And stressing humanitarianism in turn also legitimizes the military activities of the Swedish armed forces abroad. I can take the next picture, please. So humanitarianism is one important factor. Sweden actively pushes the self-image of being a peace nation and a do-gooder in international affairs. Still, factors such as an interest in gaining international influence and national security are also important in explaining the Swedish engagement abroad. For example, when justifying the expanded Swedish military presence in Mali, Minister of Defense Peter Hultqvist and various members of the Swedish parliament stressed that, quote, Sweden's participation in peace support operations are also important for our national security and for our ability to defend ourselves. So there are several reasons for this continued international engagement, and actually national internationalism or the national defense is one key aspect of this engagement. Sweden has a longer history of international engagement than any other non-aligned small state. Even since joining the League of Nations in the 1920s, Sweden has perceived itself as an important international actor, both in terms of more traditional negotiation and mediation activities, but also in participating in various international humanitarian missions and peacekeeping operations. And most of those missions have been under UN flag, but KFOR in Kosovo, OUP Libya, and ISAF in Afghanistan were under NATO command. So in sum, and which is also the case if you look at peacekeeping more generally, after the Cold War and after the turn of the millennium in particular, the activities in these military out-of-area missions have gone from being more monitoring type of missions to, and now I quote from an interview with a Swedish officer serving in ISAF, to be war-like situations. In other words, to be a much more offensive type of military engagement. So over time, a much more militarized international activity by the Swedish armed forces abroad can be discerned. However, we should also perhaps add that neither Swedish politicians nor the military talk about being at war ever. They only talk about war-like situations. And we can take the final slide. ISAF, the mission to Afghanistan, is definitely the game changer for this increased militarization. ISAF has been the largest Swedish mission as of yet. Between 2002 and 2014, somewhere between 8,000 to 9,000 Swedish troops participated. And at its height, each contingent had about 600 troops. And given the size of the Swedish military, this is quite large. And apart from New Zealand, Sweden was the only non-NATO state to lead a PRT area. And as some of you might know, Afghanistan was divided into 26 PRT areas, which is a form of administrative unit in which the goal was to support security, development, and governance in Afghanistan. And Sweden took the lead from the British of PRT Mazar-e-Sharif in 2006. And again, we have pictures, and as these pictures indicate, the Swedish armed forces developed a sort of dual image during ISAF. On the one hand, we have the image that discussion, negotiation, cooperation with local actors are very important, as the right picture indicate. And is the traditional peace nation image. At the same time, we see an increased militarization with lots of images with Swedish officers and soldiers patrolling with arms. And this latter visualization actually reflects the development of the Swedish activity in ISAF, where for being a country not having been at war for a very long time, the experience of, for instance, Swedish casualties and participating in warlike situations or warfare was a very shocking one to both politicians and to the public. But at the same time, there was a broad political support for Sweden's role in ISAF. And it has been generally stressed by both politicians and the military that it was actually a valuable learning experience for the Swedish troops. In 2017, the Swedish government ordered an official evaluation of Sweden's achievement in ISAF. And this evaluation is very, very critical against ISAF and Sweden's role there as well. But however, interestingly, it stresses that, quote, Sweden's participation in ISAF contributed to the development of certain aspects of the abilities of the Swedish armed forces. And what these abilities are, it's not spelled out, but we can imagine what they hint at. Apparently, Sweden felt that these abilities and this learning experience was valuable because it immediately went on to join, immediately after ISAF ended, Sweden went on to join the peacekeeping mission to Mali, and subsequently the French-led special task force, Takuba. And Takuba is not a peacekeeping mission. It consists of special elite forces to fight terrorism in the Sahel region. And the last picture here shows when Sweden took over the lead from the French now, this year, just recently. So in sum, and to end, Sweden's international engagement is very complex, and it contains certain frictions between peace nation versus the use of force, humanitarian ideals versus national security and national interest. And how the Swedish international engagement will develop remains to be seen. Supreme Commander Mikael Budén declared just recently an intention to again emphasize on traditional territorial defense. And this is naturally due to, among other things, Russia's activities. But to say this international engagement has clearly been an important part in Sweden's national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. And now I hand it over to Martin.
Thank you very much. And first, before I start with my intervention, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this event. I have structured my presentation in three parts. First, I will go back and give a background, looking back at the 1990s. Then I will describe the actual operations briefly that Estonia has participated in and is still participating in. And last but not least, I will say a couple of words about the public perception and the public support to international military operations in Estonia. But to start with, we need to go back to the very early 1990s. And in 1991, Estonia regained its independence after more than 50 years of occupation by both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Probably the first official mentioning of the notion of Estonia contributing to an international operation dates back to 1992. And in June that year, the first meeting of the ministers of defense of the three Baltic states took place. And one of the topics discussed was a joint contribution to United Nations peacekeeping missions. The Baltic countries were searching for a possibility to cooperate with NATO, and that was the main goal that was going to have an effect on all the other missions and operations that I'm going to describe. NATO itself, however, did not take part in this kind of activities yet. We are talking about 1991, 1992. However, to participate in a UN-led mission together with NATO members would still be a good way to get closer to NATO. That was how the thinking was going in my capital in the early 90s. And one should keep in mind that the Baltic countries were at that time not really seen as future member states of NATO or the EU either. And there was a good deal of hesitation from Western European nations to move towards closer relations. So this particular time period was, of course, a period of peacekeeping for all of Europe, as it turned out, alongside the enormous political changes and the hope for peace across Europe. The Balkans crisis had emerged. At the same time, NATO was also looking for a new face and a new ideology after the end of the Cold War. And in the beginning of the 1990s, two new pillars of NATO that have grown to prominence in today's alliance began to be built. The first one is partnership, and the other one is out-of-area operations. Estonia, as the other Baltic states, hoped that by becoming a security provider, we would one day be able to count on support, including military support, should we need it. If we jump 25 years ahead, we see that this happened when the enhanced forward presence battle groups were deployed in the Baltic states in 2017. I, of course, would like to express my appreciation of the fact that the United Kingdom is the framework nation of the battle group in Estonia, to which also Denmark, France, and Iceland contribute. So that's the introduction of, and the background to Estonia's engagement in international operations over the last decades. From the beginning, Denmark actually acted as the framework nation for all three Baltic states. Denmark was the first country to believe that the Baltic countries had the necessary capability to participate in international operations and was ready to take on the small platoon-sized units that the Baltic countries were able to offer at the time. Baltic units were thus deployed alongside the Danes in the Balkans in the mid-90s, and Estonian forces later served together also with Norwegian and Italian units in the Balkans. I will very briefly go through the different countries and theaters where Estonia has been actively involved in since the 1990s. And the first mission that Estonia was involved in was in Croatia in support of the United Nations mission there, where Estonia deployed its first platoons in 1995. A year later, Estonia deployed a platoon also to Bosnia-Herzegovina, where Estonians were to serve for altogether 11 years, first being part of a UN-led mission and then in an EU-led mission. A couple of years later, in 1999, Estonia started to contribute also to NATO's peacekeeping operation in Kosovo, called KFOR at the time. And now we'll come to the topic that my two other colleagues have already touched upon, the operation in Afghanistan. In 2003, Estonia deployed its first servicemen and women to Afghanistan, where we stayed until 2021. Altogether, we suffered 9 soldiers killed in action and 102 servicemen and women were wounded altogether. And the mission in Afghanistan was by far our largest operation. And usually we sustained an infantry company with support units amounting to 170 personnel approximately. And this is relatively much for a country of the size of 1.3 million people. The same year, meaning in 2003, Estonia deployed its first soldiers also to Iraq under US command. And in Iraq, we lost 2 soldiers and 18 were wounded. The last 2 bigger operations I will mention, or more significant operations I will mention, is the operations in Central African Republic and also in Mali. In 2014, we deployed a platoon to the Central African Republic. And while it was an EU-led operation, it took place in close cooperation with France. And since 2013, Estonia has also participated in different efforts in Mali, where our main partner also is France. It may be prudent to consider the future of international operations when we are here in 2022. And with most of the aforementioned missions having been terminated, the prospect of continuing the mission in Mali being very small, and given the security situation in Europe, it is more than likely that Estonia will find itself in a situation very soon where we focus on deterrence and defense in our region and are less able to contribute to international operations, not least because the number of missions actually has decreased over the last years. Afghanistan brought Estonia and the United Kingdom very close while operating together in the Helmand province in Afghanistan. And it was because of this close cooperation that the decision was made in 2016 that the Nato battle group, to be led by the United Kingdom, would be deployed to Estonia and nowhere else. So for Estonia, the link between participating in the operation in Afghanistan on one hand, and on the other hand, being supported at home in Estonia is very clear and tangible. And we are grateful for our British allies for all their support. And now last but not least, about the public support to participation in international operations. And this is according to a survey that the Estonian Ministry of Defense conducts every single year and has been doing so since the 1990s. The most recent one was conducted in May last year, and according to this, 2/3 of the respondents support participation in international operations, whereas 26% oppose participation in international operations. So you can see that there is strong support for being active outside our country. And when asked for the 3 most important reasons why Estonia should participate in international operations, the most common reasons are: 1, it gives the military valuable experience. 2, it guarantees military support from NATO in case of a threat against Estonia. And 3, it helps bringing peace and stability globally. So this is what ordinary Estonian taxpayers think about why we deploy forces abroad. And to conclude and to wrap up my short intervention, I would like to reiterate what Estonia's previous defense minister said last summer. He said, and I quote here, "Estonia went to Afghanistan not to bring democracy to that country, but to support allies, acting on the presumption that the allies will support us if necessary." So a conclusion would be that Estonia's policy and rationale for participating in international operations has been relatively coherent since the 1990s. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and also for once more for inviting me to this event.
Thank you, Martin, for that. Now, we'll proceed with a few questions from me. In the meantime, if anyone in the audience wants to send in questions, please don't hesitate. Just go ahead. Now, let me actually begin with you, Martin. Something you touched at the very end was about how public opinion is partially informed by this belief that it will contribute to Estonian military experience. Can you talk a little bit about what has the actual impact been on battle readiness for the Estonian military? Do you think it has been valuable in the end, or has it been too small, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you for this good question, and I think my personal view is probably the assumption is that when asking the public about this, the public probably does not have a clue about what actually the Estonian Defence Forces think about participating in these missions. But as I understand, the Estonian Defence Forces have gained a lot of experience from these operations, and I think probably the biggest impact has been from the operation in Afghanistan. Obviously, that was not the main reason why the Estonian Parliament decided to participate in the operation in Afghanistan, but that's a side effect of it. And as of today, you can see that there are many servicemen and women, officers, non-commissioned officers, and also soldiers in the Estonian forces who serve in different units today. They have also served in different international operations. So the experience that they have gained abroad is being spread in the Estonian Defence Forces.
And another question for you, Martin. You mentioned early on about the close cooperation with Latvia and Lithuania. To what extent has Estonian defence policy or military deployment been informed by what Latvia and Lithuania have decided? And to what extent do you think these countries have been impacted by Estonian decision making?
Thank you. We consult with each other in regularly, different decision makers, both in the defense forces across the Baltic states and also in the ministries of defense and obviously also in the ministries of foreign affairs. So activities are coordinated and very often, obviously, we know that we are being compared by other countries for many countries outside Northern Europe. The Baltic states sound like the same, so we better try to behave in the same way as well and participate in the same efforts. But eventually, if we, for example, look at the operation in Afghanistan, one PRT that was mentioned by Roxana, the PRT was actually led by the Lithuanians, but obviously Lithuania is the largest Baltic country. Estonia, Latvia did not have that ambition. So we chose different partners to cooperate with closely in Afghanistan. But the overall level of ambition, so to say, I would say was quite similar between the Baltic states.
Thank you. And Roxana, I had a couple of questions for you as well. In Sweden, opinions on NATO membership is quite split at the moment, although there's sort of been shifting in one direction. But in general, the left has been against it and the right has been more for it. Yet, and with the governing Social Democrats being officially against NATO membership. However, it's also been the Social Democrats who have oftentimes been carrying out these NATO missions, whether in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, with the exception of Libya being under the moderates. But even in the case of Libya, even the left party voted for it. So I'm curious, why do you think this distinction between NATO membership and military missions with NATO has emerged?
Okay, thank you for a very good question here. And I'm not sure I have the full answer to this, but it is a debate, as you said. I think that NATO membership, it's the same also. Finland is not a member of NATO either. And Finland and Sweden have really close cooperations. And also in these missions, it has been said that in Afghanistan, for instance, that Sweden was not a NATO member, but it acted as if it were a NATO member. So in a sense, you can still, keep to be free from an alliance, but you still have the cooperations. For instance, both in terms of the interventions, but also particularly in training, right? And both the Minister of Defense and this PE in Sweden have said that the trainings and cooperation are very important. So I don't know what the future holds, if there ever will be Sweden would join NATO, but at least they get all the training and cooperation. So I think that's the way they want to keep it, at least at the moment.
And additionally, you mentioned in your presentation about humanitarianism as being a central component. And I think most people who don't follow Swedish defense policy will usually imagine Sweden as a bit of a Northern European Switzerland sometimes, very much focused on foreign aid rather than the military side of it. But now that there have been these increasingly common military deployments, do you think this image of Sweden will change? And do you think it will have an impact on these sort of non-military efforts in the realm of foreign aid, for example?
It could be so. That's really an interesting question as well that we could spend lots of time talking about. Sweden has been, ever since 1956, been militarily involved in different parts of the world, right? Although, we think about, like Rasmus mentioned, Cyprus, a lot of monitoring, which perhaps military engagement that was more in line with the other aspects of Swedish foreign policy and foreign aid. So of course, this increased militarism, as I sort of hinted at, it has become a sort of tension, because Sweden still strives to be this peace nation, right? But then at the same time, you engage more and more in missions like Takuba, which is a sort of search and destroy. But then, like Martin said, we don't know. I mean, we don't know how if this international engagement will continue to the same extent as it has now since the turn of the millennium. But of course, it's a tension there between being the peaceful Sweden and also becoming a more active partner in military defense.
And one additional question. So the past 30 years, well, with the exception of the last few years, but the past 30 years have seen a general decrease in military spending by the Swedish government, and sort of, decreasing military supplies has been a question that's oftentimes come up. I'm curious if you think that has had any impact on these military deployments, or if these military deployments have been small enough to not necessarily been impacted by these sort of budget cuts.
It can be, but I think it's going to be a shift now. Mikael Bedén, the Supreme Commander, just gave an interview just this past weekend, a long interview, sort of describing the situation of the military, which was just cuts and decreases. Conscription ended, now has been reinstated, and all of Swedish military activity was actually sort of conducted abroad, right? But now it is a shift, going back home and increasing the military. So I don't know if I got the numbers right, but the plan is to more or less double the number of troops in the coming 8 years. So definitely there will be a bigger military spending. And
now to Rasmus. So the central component of your research has been the United States, essentially, the Danish-American relationship. And I'm curious if you think this has actually produced any changes in the diplomatic relationship between the two countries, and if Denmark has actually benefited from these efforts, or if it's largely gone unnoticed, perhaps.
Basically, I believe that is one of the most difficult questions to answer. If we ask Danish politicians, Danish diplomats, people who are part of the system, also the defense and so on and so forth, they all argue that Denmark's position is higher in the United States today than previously. Also, they argue that they listen more to Denmark than they have done, than the United States did earlier previously. But then if you ask the very same politicians and diplomats, well then what do Denmark get out of it? It is extremely difficult to provide us with any precise answer. It's always a matter of we are getting access, they listen to us, perhaps we get some information a bit earlier than we would get them else, instead. So another way to answer the question is to say, well, how is, for instance, the Netherlands status in the United States? Because, for instance, the Netherlands promised the Americans to participate in the invasion of Iraq, but then shortly before they decided not to do so. And there have been no sanctions according to the Dutch. So my answer would be, according to the politicians and the diplomats, Denmark has better access in Washington today than we would have had otherwise, but it is extremely difficult to measure what this access actually means.
Now, your inquiry looked specifically at Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I'm curious if you think the same analysis can be applied to Libya, for example, or other missions as well. Or if you think those are unique to those three cases.
To be honest, if you ask a historian for that kind of question, he would always answer, we need historical investigations in order to answer that. But my impression is that it is the same in Libya and Mali and so on and so forth. But there is this curve or learning process, because these decisions to engage in wars were very difficult in the early 1990s. That's easy to see when you read the documents. It was very difficult for Denmark to participate in the first Gulf War. It was very difficult for Denmark to send troops to Yugoslavia, and especially in 1998 when there was no UN mandate. It was really, really difficult. But then later on, it became still more easy because it was primarily in the beginning it was difficult, and then there was a kind of routine in it. And what we do know is that it is always a question of Denmark's relations to the United States and to NATO. So I would guess, it would be my best guess, that we would have almost the same results if we look at the documents on other conflicts.
One notable aspect in terms of Danish involvement in this military mission, specifically in Afghanistan, but also in Libya, perhaps, is the fact that Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Danish Prime Minister, was NATO Secretary General during this period. Would you attribute this perhaps to this sort of access point you were making earlier? And do you think his appointment actually had any impact on Danish deployments?
I would guess that Anders Fogh Rasmussen had a good name in Washington. I would guess that. But it was on the other hand, I would also say it was of importance for the decisions that I talked about, because Anders Fogh Rasmussen was appointed NATO General Secretary I guess in 2008 or 2009 or something like that. What I've talked about is decisions taken in the late 1990s, 2001 and 2003. So it was of no importance for these decisions, but I'm pretty sure that they liked him in Washington because of his policies while being a Danish Prime Minister. And he had access, of course.
Now, I have a question for all three of you, actually. So if anyone, all of you want to take this up, which is, oftentimes these countries are acting as sort of a second or third player to either the United States or France, for example, in the case of Africa. And oftentimes these countries will change their policies. We saw this with, for example, American withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've seen worsening French-Malian relations. And I'm wondering, to what extent are these countries able to actually plan ahead and are involved in decision-making and just have long-term strategic planning? So perhaps if you want to begin with Roxana.
Well, I guess in the case of Mali, as you mentioned it has been a long-term strategic planning, but Sweden has planned ahead and had its intentions of staying there and took over the leadership from France regarding Takuba. But of course, the reasons, what is going on in Mali naturally has spurred a debate in Sweden too, and a lot of it's been a political debate on that, whether Sweden should leave as well, right? Especially now when the Wagner group is there, and etc. And the arguments are a little bit different. Some, like the liberal parties, argue that we have to leave, we can't fight on the same side as the Wagner group, while the Swedish Democrats argue that the Swedish troops are more useful at home, right, than defending some other democracy. So long-term planning, of course, Sweden is sort of dependent on what the United States decides. When it was decided that the ISAF mission was to be downscaled and followed by the subsequent mission and eventually finished, Sweden had to follow the rest, right? So I guess that's the aspect of being a small country. We can't hear you now because your mic is.
Thank you for that. Martin, perhaps if you want to take this question as well, or?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm also a little bit hesitant to long-term planning if you are relatively small, because the main decisions and also the main resources do not belong to you really. So you are dependent on the larger nations. In case of Mali and Central African Republic, it was France from our point of view, and also in Afghanistan it was the UK and the US, obviously. So I think what is important in such cases is that each country should have its own level of ambition of what's the maximum capacity that we should be able to offer, and be sure that we don't exceed that, and then be flexible, because the smaller the country, the greater the degree of flexibility usually is. Thanks.
Now, I have a question for all three of you, and perhaps I'll begin with Rasmus, but this is a question sent in to us by Charles Clark, the former Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, who's also been part of the Baltic program. And he says, the main mentions of other countries and organizations in relation to these deployments were the UN, NATO, and the US. The EU was only mentioned in relation to Africa. How significant are EU foreign and defense policy attitudes for each of these three countries? So perhaps, if Rasmus, if you want to pick this one up.
Yeah. Not much, I would say. Denmark has its opt-outs when we talk about foreign policy and the EU. It doesn't play much of a role when we talk about military engagements, and other in vis-a-vis Africa and Denmark. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that, in my opinion, my personal private opinion, we ought to engage more in that. I guess that would be better for us. That would be better for Europe. But it doesn't play any major role right now. That's my best guess.
Roxana, if you want to follow up.
I believe it's the same for Sweden in a sense. Sweden has participated in different EU security missions, but no, I think I agree with Rasmus here that Sweden has its own set foreign and security concerns.
Martin, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I would briefly say that CCP is, of course, not important. I mean, it is, but in Estonia's point of view, NATO as a collective defense organization is always more important, and we believe that they should be complementary, so that they don't duplicate each other. So offering capabilities and being active in the EU is, of course, also important for Estonia, but the number one organization where we concentrate our efforts is and will be in the future also NATO. Thanks.
And another question we have from the audience, this time my colleague Donatus. This is actually for you, Martin, specifically. You said that the Estonian contribution to international missions would quote, guarantee, unquote, allied support for Estonia should the need arise. Could you explain how you imagine such a quid pro quo mechanism would work in the case of Russian aggressions against Estonia? Do you think that Estonia's participation in Afghanistan would matter when making war and peace decisions in the US?
Thanks. It's a good question. There are no black and white questions or answers here. I think it's the assumption that was made in the 1990s has proved to be correct. The more passive a nation is in any organization, the less likely it will be to gain any benefits from it. So the more active you are, vice versa. The more active you are, the more likely you are to get something in return, so to say. I think that's what we can count on, and that's the only guarantee. Being a member of NATO and also being the member of the EU is a constant competition with all the other member states. So I think that's what my answer is going to be. So the better we are, the more appreciated we are as well.
Now, I'll abuse my position as moderator and ask another question of my own. Looking at Afghanistan in particular and its impact, mainly the fall to the Taliban, do you think this will have any impact on how willing countries are to participate in similar missions? I know, Rasmus, you mentioned earlier that there wasn't a lot of examination on previous missions, but I'm wondering, such a major case such as Afghanistan after 20 years, but also perhaps Libya or Iraq, if they will have any long-lasting impact in your opinions. If there's anyone who wants to pick that question up first.
Sorry, impact on what?
Impact on willingness to deploy in the future.
Well, I would say that if you look at the Danish case, I would argue that the Danish public are basically not very much interested in foreign policy. So it has almost no influence on the public debate. This is basically something that is decided upon by politicians. Denmark has been engaged in eternal wars now for 20 years or so, 25 years, and there is almost no public debate about it. Of course, when it all ended in Afghanistan, there was a discussion. Then the Danish government and the Danish parliament ordered a new white book. They will have to work 2 or 3 years now on that white book. But there is almost no discussion about Denmark's military engagement right now in the Danish public sphere.
I think in relation to Sweden, I think, as I said or mentioned in my presentation there, that Sweden was quick to move on to the next intervention and the next conflict. In terms of relation to public, there is some discussions, naturally, especially now with Mali and whether Sweden should remain there. But it's been quite a strong political consent in the value of continuing having or participating in out-of-area missions.
Yes, just to much in line with the previous speakers, that I don't think that in my own country there would be a huge public debate or any strong feelings about becoming engaged in another operation of a similar scale, but I don't really see it coming either at the moment. On the other hand, I think that it may be more important what is being discussed on the high political level in organizations such as the EU and NATO. And I think that politicians on that level realize that there is not much appetite to become involved in new operations unless it is more or less necessary and unavoidable. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. And again, this is addressed for all of you. The various countries have, to varying degrees, some form of conscription at the moment. And it's oftentimes been debated in the case of the United States, for example, the role of conscription on the decline in popularity of the Vietnam War. And that sort of getting rid of conscription has made wars more likely in the case of the US. Although in the case of this, the 3 countries examined here, some form of conscription has been involved. Can you talk about whether or not conscription has made, has had any impact, and how, and which soldiers are deployed as well, whether or not it's just conscript or if it's just volunteers for specific missions? Perhaps, Martin, if you want to pick up.
Sure, I can start. Conscripts are not deployed. They could, of course, be enlisted and become enlisted, but then they would not be conscripts anymore. So I would not try to link conscription per se with participation in international operations. It's too sensitive, at least it would be for my nation, to deploy young conscripts who have been trained for 3 or 6 months on operations. Usually they are being trained for longer periods of time, and that more or less excludes the possibility of deploying conscripts, even though legally it's possible. Thank you.
It's the same in Sweden, I would say, that conscripts are not being deployed to international missions. It's the people who have signed up professionally. However, I think it was during the Afghanistan, it was almost, if you decided to work in the military, you had signed a contract that you were willing to be deployed to international missions. But I think there's 2 separate issues here. So I don't think it affects the view on international missions.
Well, I'm sorry, but my answer is basically the same.
Yeah, fair enough. And with that, I think we are just on time, actually. I could, of course, go on for hours, but I'm cognizant of everyone's time. So first of all, let me thank the 3 speakers for joining us today for a very fascinating talk. And of course, to our audience for joining us. This talk will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, Center for Geopolitics. If you missed it at the beginning or the end, you can I suppose not the end, but if you missed the beginning, you could always go back and watch it. And on that, if you want to join us for any future events, you can follow us at Center for Geopolitics. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.